Okay, thank you for inviting me and Niklas to your conference, and it's interesting to come to another country to talk about Osmoderma and take part of your insights. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science behind what we are doing, since I and Niklas and Thomas Ranius, who isn't here, and a few other guys, Matthias Larsson and Glenn Svensson in Sweden, we are to be concerned as Osmoderma dinosaurs, since we have been studying this species for nearly 30 years now. So I will try to connect research with what we call best practice now. So, concerning Osmoderma, we have performed a lot of ecological studies, and that is concerning the quality of the habitat, what they need for survival, and also their dispersal and what governs population size, something about their metapopulation dynamics. You probably recognize the word metapopulation that was described by Richard Levins in the 70s as a population of populations. That is, that you have extinctions that should be balanced by colonizations, and that have been thoroughly studied for butterflies, for example, for a research group by Ilke Hansky and his colleagues in Åland. But Osmoderma has also been one of the species that we have studied a lot concerning this. I will tell you a little bit about the communication, the pheromones that you now have such skilled experience about, and your fantastic equipment. And I will tell you a little bit about this problem, the really big problem we have, the extinction depth and the habitat history of the species that could be, and the habitat that could be very important to know. So if we start with the habitat quality, then you could see from our studies that we had a higher frequency in cavities that were directed to the sun. This is species that like warm conditions, especially in our northern parts of Europe, as we are. And we could also see that we have a higher frequency in half-open habitats, that is not a closed canopy forest. We have higher frequencies when you have cavities that are above ground. That is probably due to predation and parasitism that increase if you have cavities at ground level. And recently, we have learned that body size decreased with warmer microclimates, so that could be a bad thing with climate change then. We studied dispersal by using 3 methods. We studied the species by having this mark recapture that we could also use for finding out the population size in the trees. And we also had these radio transmitters, as you can see here. Maybe you can see the transmitter. And also we had this pheromone trapping combined with radio transmitters. And basically we got the same result, namely that the term eremita in the species name is quite good, because most of them stay in the same tree for their entire life. But also that we have quite short dispersal distances, it would be said actually here. And by that we don't say that there could be individuals that fly longer distances, but we can only see that most of the individuals, they disperse for a couple of 100 meters or so. Maybe there we could also see a big difference when we had a hot summer in compared to a cold summer, that there were more activity in dispersal and they flew longer distances. We studied population size, and we could see that it increased with wood mold volume. We measured the wood mold volume that we took the diameter inside the cavity and tried to find the depth of sort of a idealistic cone inside the tree. But we could also see the population size was bigger or increased with height over ground. And then we studied the communication, and it started actually when we had Swedish fika, drinking coffee and had a biscuit, and we started to ask ourselves, why does it smell like it does? Because we have had experience with this, very like peach smell, I would say, not plum, but differs perhaps from country to country what you prefer to call it. Actually, it's this compound that you can see here that the males emit. There were two chiral forms, chirality, you know, molecules that could be like mirrored, that you could have one molecule that is exactly the same, but it's composed a bit different, so it mirrored. So we were afraid that it would be the wrong chiral form, because then it would have been very expensive to produce this compound. But we were lucky, so it was the same compound that was used in the perfume industry. So we just called, can we have some of this gamma-decalactone that is called peach lactone actually in the industry. And you could see that there were a lot of females that were attracted to this pheromone, and nearly none to the control. Here you could see the type of trap we used then, 15 years ago. And here are some females. And by doing this study, we also learned that Elater ergineus used this compound as a pheromone, so the females and the males were attracted to this compound. And later on, but I won't show that now, we also find out about the pheromone for Elater ergineus, that is one of the most effective pheromones actually to do inventories. You put out the pheromone and they will come flying to a car, actually, if they are there, of course. Yeah, and then I will tell you a little bit about the habitat history, because in Sweden we have quite unique material concerning the history of the oak habitats, because oak were forbidden to cut on the peasant ground and the ground that the peasants could hire from the state. And because of that, we have a lot of state inventories from the 18th and 19th century that the state went out in the villages to find out how many oaks were there to cut to build these warships, so we could conquer Lithuania and some other places on earth. But this also led to that the farmers in Sweden, they really hated the oaks, because they weren't allowed to cut the oaks that were standing in the middle of the meadows. And since you know, the meadows were sort of the main thing in the former agricultural landscape, because if you don't have had many hundreds of hectares of meadows, you couldn't get hay and you couldn't hold cattle, so you couldn't get any manure, and there were bad crop next summer. So when the ban in Sweden was taken away in 1830 on peasants' grounds, they cut all the oaks. So at that time in 1830 and for the rest of the 19th century, there were millions of old oaks that were cut in the ground that wasn't wasn't the noble land, so to say. And of course, it's a problem that when the habitat disappears. But as you can see, up in the right here, it will take a while before there will be a new equilibrium. That is, that the number of species and individuals in the landscape are in equilibrium with the habitat. So we have a delayed phase here. So if this is actually the species area relationship, so it's the amount of habitat on the x-axis, and in the y-axis you can see the amount of species. So if you decrease the area of the habitat, it will take some time before the number of species decrease. And there you can see the extinction depth. And we have a reason to believe that in many landscapes, and especially perhaps in this respect with insects living in and the lichens living in very, very old and ancient trees, the extinction depth is probably extraordinarily big. So in former days, in 1830, before the oaks were cut, maybe we were here somewhere, and now we are here concerning the oaks in the landscape. So I made a study with in villages in a landscape that is highly fragmented in southeast Sweden, and I found that because then I could get a figure of how many oaks there were in 1820 before they were cut. So actually the presence of Osmorrhamma emita was much better explained by the number of trees in 1820 than it was at the year 2000. And that is, of course, a problem if we try to go out in the landscape today and measure how many ancient trees do we have and where are the species. If we think then that the numbers of trees that we find is explaining the number of species and their individuals and so on. And the right thing is that it really gives a picture instead of what it was like 200 years ago. So it implicates that it's often so that we need many more trees than we have today at perhaps a quite different scale. Maybe we'd have to increase it by 10 or 100 times the old trees. We have also studied this metapopulation dynamics, and by this we mean that every tree that is suitable is sort of one possible place for a population. And then when we started to look at the trees and the population sizes, we could see, as maybe you could see in the red rectangles here, that there are some trees that holds a large portion of the total metapopulation, that is about 30% for this tree, for example. So that, of course, implies that these trees are really important. If you cut these trees, or they will suddenly die, it could have immense, it could really matter for the metapopulation. But we also now know that, you see on this figure that is from a quite recent paper, it's a bit blurry, but you could also see that some of the trees that we started to have big populations in, they were decreasing quite quickly, and there are some others that have increased. And by this we can see that when we have a succession in the stand and in the tree, especially in the trees, they sort of the population seems to be what we call habitat tracking. So they, in a couple of years or 10 or 20 years, they move to a tree that is a bit earlier in the succession. And that is probably because they like these trees with a lot of wood mold, and they dislike the trees where you have succession has gone so far that you have not so much wood mold, that is more like a chimney. I could see that the colonization and extinction rates were higher than the annual observed mortality, so that couldn't mean the mortality couldn't just explain this. So when we really want to think about Osmoderma in the long run and what we do for conservation measures, it's very important to think about this successional development, and also, of course, as you are doing the spatial connectivity within and between stands. So I will tell you a little bit also about some research that are done about the oaks and different aspects about them, and also how especially Carl Olof Bergman and Niklas and others have tried to count on how many old oaks we need for long-term survival. And then if we start to think about this when we get sort of new hollows in the old oaks, we can see that research from Östergötland in Sweden has shown that at the age between 200 and 300 years, 50% of the trees had hollows. But if we look at the trees that are below 200 years, there are nearly none that are hollow. And in Sweden, at least, the normal cutting age of oak is 120 years. So it's 80 years before they start to be hollow. You could also see that fast-growing trees, they got hollow before the other ones. And also that could be explained by that if you have an open standing tree, you get larger branches, and then you could also get these hollows, because if you have a too small branch, maybe the oak will just grow over this broken branch. And then we had a study of the influence of forest regrowth by Niklas and Thomas Arnius. And there you found that there were a higher species richness in stands with the large freestanding trees, and also that large girth was important. That's not very important for Osmoderma, but for maybe the majority of the species. And also you found then that the forest regrowth was detrimental not only for the trees but also for the beetles. So, as we have said so many times, as most localities with endangered beetles living in old oaks are small and isolated, ongoing management and the restoration of abandoned pasture woodlands should have a high priority. Then you could try to figure out what proportion of the hollow trees are suitable and how many trees you need in a functional metapopulation. And this Carl Olof Bergman in Sweden has done a lot. You know, in some exploitation aspects, the politicians say, oh, we want to build houses here instead of these ancient oaks. And then the question could be posed, okay, how many oaks do we need to keep this population? How many can we cut? So in the early days, Niklas and Kjell Antonsson in Sweden, they made this scale that we have used a lot in our tree inventories. So here is sort of the first succession where this hollow is made by Dendrocopus major, the great spotted woodpecker. But for Osmoderma, it's mostly these types of trees where you have a lot of wood mold that is important. And when you come to this stage, it's more interesting for Gnomus variabilis, for example. When they count on these, they sort of have to make this statement that they work with stable age distribution and stable populations in relation to age distribution. The problem is that in nature this is dynamic, so you could have stochastic events. So it's even worse in nature. So, but this study, they used 16,500 inventories oaks with some measurements on stem diameter and successional stage of the cavity. And they built a static life table. So they found out that 15% of the area could hold oaks in a stable population, and half of them will be in a successional stage with a large wood mold volume. So 85% of the area will then consist of young oaks without hollows. And this is of course important, and you talked about that in many areas we have really problems with that. We have too few oaks and too few young oaks. And since this is such a long process, it's really a challenge for us, because we often think about what will happen next half year and so, and here we have to think about what will happen in 300 or 400 years. So Niklas and his colleagues, they also made a study about the scales and at what scale is it important for the different species. And that differed a lot, of course, if you look at different species. So Osmoderma eremita is really a good species. It's a good indicator and it's a good umbrella species. But we also, of course, have to understand that there are so many other species that had a bit different opinions about their habitat, and their dispersal is different and so on. And then I won't translate everything. The thing is that you could make a lot of thought. So this is a minimum number of suitable oaks. And the whole point of this is to find out how large area do we need to protect a population of Osmoderma and the predator Elateophorogenius, for example. So you have to make a lot of statements at different stages to count on this. I only mention now the years and the names, but if anyone would be interested, I could produce a literature list if you would like afterwards. Then Niklas, you can.
Or is there any questions to Jonas first, perhaps? I don't know. If I will just jump in and have a short.
Or we'll take the
part.
Questions afterwards. I think
Okay.
it would be more convenient.
Kaip tai klausimai Jonui bus, dabar jie čia jungtinį pranešimą padarys, klausimai Jonui bus po to, kai jie pabaigs.
Wow.
Okay. We take it later on. Okay. I will make a short jump in here just to tell you a little bit about the history about this woodmont box, and how I started everything. And I had it in my mind for quite a long time when I was younger. But it was when I started reading papers, and it was actually a small, obscure paper from UK that made me really interested. And I see here, is it, what is it? That one, okay, thank you. It was a man named Tate Green from UK. He was the manager of the oak stands around the castle Windsor. And he was included in a mini study, we can say, about a very rare species, a click beetle called Limeniscus violaceus. We can say violet click beetle, living in hollow beech trees in Windsor Castle forests. But the two trees that they know about fell in a storm. And they've got panic, of course, because, oh, this is the last trees in UK. But they re-erected them, made some new holes, filled them with sawdust and leaves, some droppings from pigeons, and a dead cat. This was very strange, but a good idea, I think. Then they forgot this experiment and came back 6-7 years later, and when they digged in the bottom here, they were full of this beetle. So it was successful. And we went there to visit Ted. And of course, this was not real science. So Thomas Ranius and maybe wanted to do it more in a scientific way as a researcher. So we took the idea home to Sweden. And there is Thomas. And started to produce simple boxes, just like bird boxes, and fill them with a material similar to what Ted had done. They were pretty small, they were 70 liter. And the main thing was oak sawdust, oak leaves, and water. But of course, we made some different versions, but not dead cats. We used chickens instead for that. It's hard to find so many dead cats without getting problem with the public. But we learn a lot because we think we start a quite nice set here. We had some places, cure areas where we had many of these species. We know they lived in the hollow trees, and then we could find different directions. There were no hollow trees, so we can understand a little bit how far these species goes when they colonize new trees. So it was a quite complicated thing. But anyway, by that time, I used clay in the bottom, making the boxes really heavy. And it works quite nice to keep moisture. But when it dries out one time, then you know it's crack-light and then the water goes through. So it was a smart idea. So now we use other things to keep moisture. But the result was quite shocking. They were really effective, these boxes. You see here, the 47 boxes, a lot of individuals, 140 saprosodic species. And if we compared to the real cavities, it was over 70% of the species that we found in the hollow oaks that we found in some of the boxes, not in all boxes, of course, but in total. They could actually take the tree's position a little bit. But remember, it's only the species living in the cavity. It's not the whole species composition that live in the trees, because then we talk about 500-600 species, 500 species. Yeah, for the nerds here, you can see here the most common species. And here is the top class species, the ones that were red listed by that time in Sweden. And many of them have been mentioned here in Frank Gidra's presentation, for instance. And what we also found out was that the species that we didn't get into the boxes, they were those who like red rot the better. So here you see a composition of species that were more common in the real trees, because we can't create a red rot situation in a box, because those fungi need another situation. They can't live in a sawdust and a compost. They need solid wood. And also we could learn here that this is a species composition for each tree, and the quadrats here is the boxes. But here you see how all the trees, those compositions are quite to the left, and the boxes 100 meters away had a quite similar composition as the trees. And the more far away the boxes were situated, the less similar to the real trees the composition were. Quite natural, but it's nice to show it in a research situation. And again, these results are easy, that can be misused by people when they don't understand. As I said, it's only the hollow tree species, some of them, that we can leave in the boxes. They can't take the trees fully delivery. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So then, after this expose of different research, we have sort of formed our thinking about the best practice in restoration and management of oak-dominated habitats. And of course, we start with focusing on the stands and the areas that we are working in, and we could see that many of them, the regrowth is a big problem, and also that we have a closed canopy. The closed canopy is also a problem because you don't get any oak regeneration in these areas. That could be solved, of course, by having areas next to it where you have this oak regeneration instead. But if you don't have that, then you could have a problem. Typically in areas in southeastern Sweden, as I think here in Lithuania, also we have problems with Capinus betulus regrowth in areas where you have stopped the grazing or stopped mowing. Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then we also stress that you have to have a stable economy, and you have to do this restoration in sort of in a long-term perspective. So in many cases, when you want to open up next to these ancient trees to take away the regrowth, you make this in several steps. So you won't shock the trees either by too much light, too much nutrients, or too much water. So of course it's very, very important to keep these ancient trees alive as long as possible, and that you eliminate the regrowth. But it also, I think sometimes we stop at the stage that we will keep the tree alive, but really we want to keep the species inside the tree also alive. And that means that you have to have some sun that comes in, that can shine on the stems and the cavities. Of course, it's also important to manage the other trees, so you get new ancient trees in 50 years or 100 years or so. But sometimes it's, as we have been speaking about, and we will speak when Niklas talk about it, you have to also deal with the younger trees in the sense that you veteranize them to try to get these habitats quicker than you would do otherwise, and also with this complement with the wood mold boxes. And it's always also I think it's important to think about the priority when we do this restoration and management, that you prioritize these areas with a high biodiversity and that has a large number of ancient trees, because these areas are often, at least, the most species rich, and then you have the possibility to have these areas as being source areas for the areas around. And of course you have to focus on sites or a group of sites that are in close vicinity of each other, so you could get dispersal between these areas. I think I'll stop there.
Ačiū Jonui ir Niklui. Ir dabar prašom užduoti klausimus. Aš manau, su klausimais darykim taip, kas jaučiatės komfortabiliai, klauskite angliškai, o kas norit klausti lietuviškai, aš išversiu. If questions come in Lithuanian, I will just translate.
I'm thinking about distribution of Osmoderma eremita, and if you look similarities to the bird ecology, so it's often that travel distances from the nest to the feeding ground depends on the availability of these feeding grounds, and the closer feeding grounds are, the closer the species is traveling, because it's just not wasting the energy. Can it be similar situation with Osmoderma eremita, that in good conditions, when the habitats are good, the species is not traveling, but if the habitat conditions do change, the travel distance increases? Was there some kind of such research, especially with these wooden boxes? I don't know which one of you can answer that.
I know that when they had this study with the pheromones and dispersal, and they had these radio transmitters, they didn't find any beetles that went further from more than 400 meters. But they had pheromones at different places at a long distance. And I think the problem is with Osmoderma is that it has this evolutionary history, that it was very close to the other hollow tree. So it's not that, I mean, a female Osmoderma could probably, if it would allocate a lot of resources to dispersing, they could, for sure, go away several kilometers. But they won't do that because this selection pressure in the evolutionary time. But if there would be such lucky happenings that some females, of course, could colonize 10 kilometers away, and she would start a thriving population, maybe that could change, but it's not very likely, actually.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I have one little comment on this. In Latvia, we make a study about this dispersion of Osmoderma last year, and we use also mark recapture methods. And our results shows what maybe these distances are bigger than we think now, because bigger distances of Osmoderma flight detected last year was about 3 kilometers. So this research was carried out in territory where the populations are big and strong, and with a lot of hollows, a lot of hollow trees. But the problem is that our marking system was not the best solution. So we tried to glue with bee markers, queen bee markers, on the wings of this species, but it doesn't work because the connection between these wings and this marker is quite low. And this year, we also now we have started with research, the new stage of research, and we will use rubber rings with numbers and what we put on the legs of the beetles. So I hope that after this season we will have any new results about dispersion, about population size, because in this research we have very successful trapping. We select 3 territories in Latvia, big territories, Ziemeļgauja, where population is quite big, Lubāna Mitrais, what Gedrius also show these pictures from this territory. And also one more territory in western part of Latvia. And this result shows what we have about 40 traps in each territory in distance of about 6 kilometers from the one and last trap. And almost all traps was successful during all season. So we have a lot of individuals, but due to this not successful marking, we have no conclusions about all results. But I think after this season we have some new information, and we will share this information. But I hope that I agree with Nicholas, who said what some individuals flying a lot and a lot of individuals not flying, but I hope that real dispersion possibilities of this species are quite maybe also bigger when we think at this moment. Thank you.
I think also that you have a very important point there, that if you have a very large population, this it increases the chances of having long dispersal. Okay.
Taip, dar klausimų.
My question is about the veteranization of the trees. We understand that oak trees in your country and in our country are deficit species. Yeah, oaks missing in our landscapes. So, are there any scientific attempts to make other tree species accessible for the species by helping infecting with red rot or brown rot, how do you call the fungus species? Perhaps it would help species to survive until next generation of 400 years old oaks will be suitable for the species.
Yeah, our research about veteranization has been focusing on beech and oak, Fagus sylvatica and Quercus ubu. But you're right in that sense that you have some other tree species that could make really, that you could get hollow much earlier, like alder, for example, lime and ash trees. So it could be interesting to start to veteranize them, but also it's important when you do management that you don't only think about oaks, that you always also think that you have to have all the other deciduous trees around, so that you sort of spare them when you do management and so on. So alder, for example, and lime trees are really good in that sense.
Ar dar kas nors turėtų klausimų? Jeigu ne, tai padėkosim Jonui. Thank you very much.